Okay, to start off, I would like to say a little bit about what atheism is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what atheism is and means. It's not a claim of certainty. It's not a claim of knowledge. Atheism is a response to the assertion by theists that there exists a supernatural being that has either created the world or intervenes in the world or is the source of our morality. When I made this point in Galway, Hamza suggested that that meant that I was an agnostic. So I'd like to clarify the difference between atheism and agnosticism. Atheism and theism are assertions about what you believe, whether you believe a God exists or whether you don't believe that a God exists. Agnosticism exists in a different realm of discourse. Agnosticism is about claims of knowledge. You can believe that a God exists, yet not claim to know that a God exists, and therefore be an agnostic theist. Or you can believe that no God exists, yet not claim to know that for certain, and thereby be an agnostic atheist. It's not the case that you have theism at one end, atheism at the other, and then agnosticism somewhere in the middle as I don't know. Most people who evaluate their worldviews based on science take the view that we can never know anything for certain. All we can do is gradually move closer to the truth by trying to match what we believe is the case with our observations about reality. And on that basis, I'm going to suggest that when we examine reality, that the arguments for the non-existence of gods are more persuasive than the arguments for the existence of gods. Firstly, I'm going to suggest that there's more persuasive evidence that the universe came about naturally than that God's created it. Because every generation we find out more about how the universe operates. And every generation, the bits that we don't yet understand, a lot of us say, well, God did that. And every generation we shift more and more explanations from the category of God did that to the category of now we understand how it happened naturally. And we never see any explanations moving in the opposite direction. We don't have examples where we once had a scientific explanation of how things worked, and we've now discovered that actually God did it. There's a relentless shift from people believing in supernatural beings being the cause of things to people understanding how they happen naturally. If you take how the universe was created from the Big Bang onwards, we can see that initially people thought that the earth existed as a sort of flat bed and that heavens existed above it. And then people thought that the earth was static, but that the sun and the moon circled around the earth. And then we discovered that that wasn't the case. In fact, the sun is at the centre and the planets centre around that, and that was discovered by observation. We then discovered that it's gravity and not gods that keep the planets in those orbits. And we then discovered that the sun is not even at the centre of our galaxy. And then we discovered that there are more galaxies, that there are over 100 billion of these galaxies, each of which has over 100 billion stars similar to our sun. And the more that we discover, the more that we realise that the Earth is really quite an insignificant part of the cosmos. It's not, as people used to think, understandably, in generations gone by, used to think that the Earth was the centre of everything. We now know, as well as that all of these planets and all of these galaxies are moving further and further away from each other. And we can measure the speed at which they're moving away from each other by measuring the type of light that is displayed by them. And we can work backwards from that to suggest that if everything is moving away from each other at those speeds, if you run the film backwards, so to speak, that everything at one stage was all compressed together into an immeasurably small, immeasurably dense, immeasurably hot point from which everything expanded. And if we take the step before that to say what happened before the Big Bang, in some sense it's a meaningless question in terms of the language that we use. Because with the Big Bang, time and space were both created. There was no time before the Big Bang, so there was no time in which anything could have caused anything. So we need to find a new way of language to address the question before even coming to conclusions about what may have caused what. The second thing we need to look at is the idea of causation. Scientists have discovered in the field of particle physics that when you get down to the size of particles that are below the size of an atom, that the laws of physics and the laws of cause and effect don't operate at that level in the same way as they do when those particles combine together to form atoms and then objects such as this desk or this room or the sun or the moon or the stars. That when you get down to particle level, there's a different set of physical laws that we're still working to understand. And so we don't know the answer. But what we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence is that given that all along the way, every one of these questions we have found that the answers that we have found are natural and are replacing supernatural, previously thought supernatural answers. That unless we have compelling evidence to the contrary, it's safe to assume that the answer that we find will be a natural one. As Hamza said, even if you accept the argument that there was a cause, and let's grant that for the sake of this discussion, and ignore the cause and effect of particle physics being different. But even Hamza suggested that all you can take from that is that there was something that was uncaused, that in turn caused the universe to happen. There is nothing to suggest that that something was supernatural. And a lot to suggest, based on our experience of everything else that we found out, that it was natural. If you take Occam's razor to it, there's no need to add in, and certainly no justification to add in, the idea that whatever may have caused it had a mind, had consciousness. That's just coming out of nowhere. There's absolutely... That's where Hamza's argument breaks down logically. There's no reason to take the jump to say that because you believe that there was something there, that therefore it had a mind. If we move on from that to the idea of this mind suggesting that the being has the capacity to have relationships with us as human beings, then that brings us to the question of whether and why and how a being that created 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars within each would do that and then wait 14 billion years and then say, I'm going to pick just this galaxy out of the 100 billion galaxies, and I'm going to pick just this star, which is our sun, out of the 100 billion stars within that galaxy. And I'm going to pick just this one of the millions of species that have existed on that tiny planet evolving around that star. And I'm going to pick one group of people within that, and then pick one of them and tell them that it's really important that you stop gathering sticks on the Sabbath. It's an extraordinary set of priorities that something that had created 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each would have. The more we discover about how vast the universe is, the more we realise that the real arrogance is to fool ourselves into believing that it was all created for our benefit. We're just one of a vast amount of species on one tiny planet. And the chances are substantial that there are other beings existing on other planets in other galaxies. We're already finding that one of the moons of Jupiter has more water than exists on all of Earth, and water is one of the prime signs of the potential of life existing somewhere. I'm going to suggest next that there is good evidence to suggest that our sense of morality does not come from God's, and that our sense of morality comes from something that is inherent within us, which is the realization that if we empathize with other living beings, that it's a bad thing to cause other sentient beings to suffer unnecessarily, and that it's a good thing to help other sentient beings to flourish. In Sam Harris's latest book about the moral landscape, he suggests that the only assumption that you have to make about morality is to realize that the worst possible of all worlds would be one in which every sentient being, every conscious being, was unnecessarily suffering to the greatest magnitude. And if you assume, which most rational people will, that that would be the worst possible world, then any step away from that is a step in the direction of what is morally good, and any step towards that is a step towards what is morally bad. There's no need to bring gods into the equation, and even if you do bring gods into the equation, even if you do suggest that a god tells us what's right and what is wrong, then a further question arises, which was addressed centuries ago in Plato's dialogues in the Euthyphro dilemma, which is the question of, does this God, assuming you believe it exists, does it simply decree things to be good or bad based on its own personal whims, in which case it could have chosen to decree that torturing people randomly for fun is morally good? Or if that sounds odd to you, if you think, no, a God wouldn't have made that decision, then the other option is that that God is identifying what is right and wrong by reference to some sort of independent criteria. And then you have to ask yourself, what are those criteria? And that essentially brings atheists and theists back to the same plane of trying to identify together what is right and what is wrong. In Galway, Hamza approached this dilemma by saying that God, rationally speaking, is the only being worthy of worship, and the only being worthy of worship is the highest moral being. But that doesn't really get away from the question, because then you have to ask yourself, by what criteria are you saying that it's the highest moral being? Is it the highest moral being because it chooses whatever it wants to do, and that is what morality is? Or is it simply pointing us towards, which I think is the strongest that you could claim if you claim that there is a God, some sort of independent criteria for what is right and what is wrong? And I suggest that most of us intuitively would realise that whether you believe it comes from gods or whether you believe that it's something that we work out ourselves, that it's somewhere in the area of the impact of our actions on the suffering or the flourishing of sentient beings. I'm going to address, for the last 10 minutes here, some of the arguments that have been put forward, both here and also some of the arguments in Galway's debate, for the Quran and for the existence of the wishes of God and the scientific arguments in the Quran as evidence of the existence of a God. And I'm going to say, first of all, that the Quranic challenge of the book being inimitable is a non sequitur. No matter how well written a book is, or no matter how unique it is, or how inimitable it is, that says nothing about whether or not a God wrote it. You may believe that a God exists, but you can't prove it, or even come close to proving it, by saying that a unique book exists. James Joyce, an Irish writer, wrote a book called Ulysses, about which the exact same type of claims that are made about the inimitability of the Quran are made about Joyce's book, but not with any suggestion that it has any reference to it being written by a god. I'm going to point to some of the scientific claims that were made in the Galway debate and just respond briefly to them. It was suggested that the Quran predicted the Big Bang, and on the basis of it saying that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation and then clove asunder. Now, if that's intended as a description of the Big Bang, it's simply inaccurate. The earth didn't exist for about 9 billion years after the Big Bang, and it wasn't separated from anything. The earth, if you assume that the heavens in this context are what was created at the Big Bang, the earth is simply part of the cosmos. It's not separate from the cosmos. It was formed by the collapse of a cloud of dust, and in the same way that gradually many stars and planets have been formed by accretion of matter sticking together. It's also inconsistent with the other claims in the Quran about the nature of the cosmos. The idea that the sun and the moon follow paths around the earth, which we know that they don't. The idea that there's only one sun and one moon, which is all that's mentioned in the Quran, which we know is not the case. And various other verses that are inconsistent with the idea of that claim being about the Big Bang. There was a suggestion made in Galway that the Quran says that fresh water and seawater don't mix, and that is the assertion that Muhammad was aware of that shows that he was inspired by God to make that assertion. But it's just not true. Seawater and fresh water do mix. There is a stage of density where one is stage because one is denser than the other. That one rises to the top and the other doesn't. But within the ocean, that only lasts for a very small period of time, and the fresh water from the rivers do mix with the sea. It's just a scientific fact. It's just a mistaken suggestion to suggest that it's otherwise. The idea that mountains are pegs, which was again mentioned today, firstly doesn't even make sense. What are they pegging the earth to? And secondly, we know how mountains are formed. They're formed by plate tectonics. They're formed by plates underneath the earth bumping up against each other. And when one of them pushes over the other, it moves up. The other one moves down. There's your mountain, and there's your roots underneath it. It's scientifically known how mountains are formed, and it's nothing to do with being pegged into the earth for some hypothetical reason. The pegging into the earth is something that comes straight from Hindu mythology. If you read the Hindu books, you'll find the same assertion, that God pegged the earth in that way in order to keep it stable. There's a piece about embryology that was mentioned in Galway, which I might leave till tomorrow's debate in the Royal College of Surgeons, because it'll be more interesting there. And finally, I just want to touch on the idea that the Quran portrays the essence of moral goodness. I'm going to suggest that it doesn't. And when I said this on Monday, Hamza suggested that I was caricaturing the Quran. And I want to stress here that I am not caricaturing the Quran. There are two ways of caricaturing the Quran. One is to say that everything in it about moral claims is correct, and the other is to say that everything it says about moral claims is wrong. I'm doing neither. What I'm saying is that the Quran contains a lot of assertions of a moral scale that are morally good. It suggests that you shouldn't lie, that you should be good to your parents, that you should be good to the poor, that you should set slaves free, that you shouldn't oppress people, that there should be no compulsion in religion. There are a lot of things in the Quran that are morally very good. There are also things in the Quran that are morally bad. The Quran suggests that men can beat their wives. Now, I don't care what the circumstances are about what you have to go through in terms of stages before you reach the stage of beating your wife. I think that's morally unacceptable. I think it's morally unacceptable to suggest that a woman can only inherit half as much as a man, or that a woman's evidence is only worth half of that of a man. I think it's morally unacceptable to suggest that under any circumstances you should cut off the hands of thieves. I think it's morally unacceptable to suggest that under any circumstances you should kill people simply because they have a change of belief about religion. And again, irrespective of whatever judicial process that you go through, it is simply morally wrong to kill somebody because of what they believe. So in terms of all of those areas that I've covered tonight, in terms of the suggestion that the idea that there's a natural reason why the universe exists, being more persuasive, is that the end, or have I got a minute? Okay. Okay, I'll conclude by saying that I hope that I have shown some arguments that the evidence that the universe is natural and does not contain an intervening God that is the source of morality is more persuasive than the opposite, and that the Quran is a very well written book that includes a lot of things that are very good and also things that are morally bad, unless of course you happen to believe that everything in it is automatically correct, in which case there's very little I can say to persuade you. Thanks very much.